The kettle had not been set for 2 people in 9 years. Mabel Forsyth knew this because she had counted. Not deliberately, the way a person counts days on a prison wall, but the way you count something you cannot stop noticing. 9 winters of a single cup on the stove. 9 summers of one plate, cooling in the window while she waited for the heat to break. 9 Christmases of leftover bread she gave to the Halverson children, because she could not bear to eat it alone across 4 days. She was 53 years old, and she had grown accustomed to the sound of her own name spoken only by the minister on Sundays, and the postmaster when a letter came from her sister in Ohio. She did not mind it the way she once had. She had made peace with the stillness, the way you make peace with a scar. You stop pressing it, you let it settle into the skin, and you get on. Her house sat on the east end of Larimer Street in the town of Dunmore, Colorado, in the year 1884. The lot beside hers had belonged to the Crandall family since before the war. And when old Tobias Crandall died in the spring of 1875, his son Gerald took the house and lived in it alone. Gerald was a quiet man, steady in his habits, slow to speak, and slower still to invite conversation. He worked at the feed and grain store 6 days a week. He kept a kitchen garden along the south side of the house. He nodded to Mabel across the fence when he came home each evening, and she nodded back. And that was the whole of it. They had been neighbors for 9 years. They had eaten alone for 9 years. Neither of them had said a word about it. Mabel had come to Dunmore as a young bride. Her husband, Robert Forsyth, had been a carpenter of some talent and considerable good humor, and she had loved him without reservation for 11 years before his heart stopped one Tuesday morning in February, with no warning at all. She had found him at the workbench in the backyard, his plane still in his hand. The doctor said it had been quick. She supposed that was meant to be a comfort. She sold the carpentry tools within the month because she could not look at them. She kept everything else, including the house and the small savings and the habit of rising at 5 in the morning that Robert had instilled in her without ever meaning to. She took in mending. She baked bread for the hotel on Thursday and Friday. She tended her garden and she minded her business, and she let the years pass with the particular patience of someone who has stopped expecting them to change. Gerald Marsh had arrived in Dunmore a year after Robert died, which Mabel had always thought a strange coincidence, without being quite sure what it was a coincidence of. She had watched the wagon come down Larimer Street from her front window, watched a man of perhaps 45 climb down stiffly and stand looking at the old Crandall house as though taking its measure. He was not tall, but he was broad across the shoulders, with the kind of face that has been weathered into something honest. He wore a dark coat that had been good once. He carried a single trunk and 2 wooden crates, and he hired no one to help him. She had watched him carry his own things inside, one trip at a time, in the first chill of October. She had not introduced herself that day. She was not sure why. It had not felt like the right moment, and then the moment had passed, and after that there had been the fence between them and all the seasons that followed it. She knew the broad facts of him, the way you know the facts of anyone in a town that size. His wife had died back in Missouri. He had a son somewhere, grown, who wrote letters but did not visit. He was regarded at the feed store as honest and capable, and not particularly warm. He had never, in all that time, asked her a single personal question. Mabel had told herself she preferred it that way. She had not always been honest with herself. The winter of 1884 arrived early and with a temper. By the second week of November, the ground was hard, and the sky over the mountains had taken on that particular flat white color that the old-timers said meant a long, cold season ahead. Mabel laid in extra wood and checked her stores and did everything a sensible woman alone does to prepare. On the Saturday before the first true snowfall, she was carrying an armload of wood from the stack at the back of the lot when she misjudged the porch step and went down hard on her right knee. The wood scattered. She sat in the cold mud for a moment, more startled than hurt, and then she heard the gate in the fence between the properties open. Gerald Marsh came across the yard in his shirt sleeves. He did not say anything. He picked up the scattered wood first, stacking it in the crook of his arm, with the same unhurried economy he applied to everything, and then he set it on the porch railing and turned to look at her. He held out his hand. It was such a plain thing. No flourish, no speech about whether she was all right. Just a hand extended in the cold November air. Rough-palmed and steady waiting, she took it and got to her feet. He looked at her knee. "You should get inside." That was all he said. Then he picked up the rest of the wood and stacked it neatly beside the door and went back through the gate without another word. Mabel stood on her porch and watched him go, and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the particular discomfort of having been looked after. The snow came that evening. It came heavily, the way it does in Colorado when it means it, and by Sunday morning Larimer Street was buried under 2 feet of white. Mabel rose at 5 and looked out her kitchen window and saw the street and the fence and the quiet shape of the house next door, one lamp already burning in the downstairs window. She stood at the stove and boiled water for her cup and looked at the single cup on the counter. Then she looked at the cabinet where Robert had kept his cup, which she had moved to the back of the shelf after he died and had not touched since. She thought about the hand extended in the cold. She thought about the fence and all the evenings of nodding across it and never once having asked a single question. She set the kettle back on the stove and opened the cabinet and took down the second cup. She set it on the counter beside the first. Then she went to the shelf where she kept the 2 plates she used for company, which was to say she almost never used them, and she took one down and set it on the table beside her own. She stood back and looked at the 2 plates side by side on the table she had eaten at alone for so long. She stood there for a long time. Then she put the second cup back in the cabinet, not because she had changed her mind about the cup, because it was too early and she had not decided anything yet, and she needed to think. She left the second plate where it was. She fried 2 eggs and ate them standing up, which she always did when she was unsettled. She looked out the window at the snow. She looked at the lamp in the kitchen window at Gerald Marsh Place. She looked at the second plate on the table. After breakfast, she put on her heavy coat and her boots, and she took the path around to the front and knocked on the door of the house next door. For the first time since the spring of 1875, when she had brought Tobias Crandall a pot of soup, and he had died 2 weeks later. Regardless, Gerald answered the door in his work vest. He had been expecting no one. His expression did not quite rearrange itself into welcome, but it did not close off either. He looked at her with the same waiting steadiness he brought to everything. "I have bread rising," Mabel said. "I always make more than I need. If you are not occupied at noon, I thought you might come for Sunday dinner." She had not planned to say it that way. She had planned something more indirect, more hedged. But the words had come out plain, and she let them stand. Gerald looked at her for a moment. Then he looked past her at the snow, and then back at her. "I would be glad to." Gerald looked once more at the snow before he turned back inside. He showed up at noon with his hat in his hands and a small paper-wrapped parcel that turned out to contain 4 small potatoes he had been keeping in his cellar, which he offered without explanation, and she accepted without asking for one. She put them on to boil, and they sat in the kitchen while she checked the bread, and he did not seem to find the silence awkward, and neither, she realized, did she. They ate at the table she had eaten at alone for so many years. She set the bread between them on the board Robert had made from a piece of walnut he had been particularly proud of. Gerald looked at the bread, and then at the board. "That is good wood." Gerald ran one finger along the grain. "My husband made it," Mabel said. "He was a carpenter." Gerald nodded. He picked up the bread knife and cut 2 slices without being asked and set one in front of her. "Mine was a schoolteacher." He said it the way he might say the weather had been cold. A moment passed. "She taught the little ones," he added, "the ones who were afraid." Mabel did not say she was sorry. It seemed too small for what he had just offered. Instead, she poured his tea and set the cup in front of him, and that was its own kind of answer. They ate the dinner and the potatoes and most of the bread, And at the end of the meal, Gerald stood and carried his plate to the basin without being told to, and washed it and set it on the rack. Then he put on his coat and his hat, and he thanked her in the same plain way he had accepted the invitation, without excess, without sentiment, without pretending it was anything other than what it was. It was the best meal I have had in some time. He settled his hat on his head and did not wait for her to answer. She believed him. That was November. By December, they had established a pattern neither of them had explicitly agreed to, which was the best way to establish a pattern because it meant neither of them had to admit to wanting it. He came for Sunday dinner. In return, though he had not been asked, he stacked her wood for the week and cleared the path to her gate when the snow came. She sent bread over on Thursdays because she was making it anyway for the hotel, and it was no trouble to make a small extra loaf. Their conversations were slow and unhurried and often long. She learned that he had come to Dunmore not for any particular reason, but because he had sold the farm in Missouri after his wife Ruth had died, and he had not been able to think where else to go, and Dunmore was 3 days west, and he had stopped because he was tired of moving. She told him she understood that, which was true. She understood it completely. He told her about his son Thomas, who had gone to Denver and married well and written letters regularly, and visited twice in all the years since, which Gerald said without bitterness, but with the particular flatness of someone who has learned to expect a thing, and has made a kind of peace with expecting less. She told him about her sister in Ohio, who wrote every 2 months with cheerful news about her grandchildren, and sometimes included a pressed flower, which Mabel kept in the Bible, even though she was not entirely sure why. She told him about the mending work. He listened the way he did everything, fully and without hurry, and he asked what she charged, and when she told him he said, in the same tone he would use to report the weather, that she was charging too little and she ought to put her rate up in the spring. She told him she would think about it. She had been thinking the same thing for 2 years and had not done it, which was a thing she did not share with him, but which she thought about for several days after. By January he was coming for supper on Wednesdays as well, and she had stopped thinking of it as something that needed to be justified. The recurring thing was the breadboard. Robert had made it, and she had used it every day for 20 years, and she noticed now the particular care Gerald brought to it when he set the bread on it or picked it up to pass it. He handled things with deliberation. He never set anything down carelessly. She had not seen that quality in a man since Robert, and she was aware of noticing it without being ready to name what the noticing meant. In February, the trouble started. The trouble had a name. It was Harlan Pokey, and he owned the mercantile on the main street and the lot behind it, and 2 other lots besides, and he had been trying to acquire the Crandall property since Tobias Crandall died. He had offered on it 3 times, each time a little more, and each time Gerald had declined without explanation. Harlan was not accustomed to being declined. He was a large, red-faced man of 50 who wore his prosperity loudly, and had the particular confidence of someone who has rarely been told no, and has come to confuse that with being right. In February, he came to the feed store while Gerald was working, and he told Gerald in front of 2 witnesses that he was prepared to make one final offer on the property, and that Gerald would be wise to take it, given that a man in his position, alone with no family nearby and no particular claim on the community, would find Dunmore difficult to remain in if the right people decided to make it. So, one of the witnesses was a young man named Price who worked the grain counter, and who told his mother that evening what he had heard, and his mother told the minister's wife. And the minister's wife told Mabel on Thursday when she came to collect the bread for the Sunday social. Mabel thanked her and walked home and stood in her kitchen for a while. She was not a woman who acted quickly in anger. She had learned early that anger spent fast leaves nothing behind but the ash of it, and ash does not build anything. She waited until Sunday. At Sunday dinner, she set the bread on the board between them and poured the tea, and then she said, quite directly, because she had found that Gerald Marsh responded to directness the way a steady horse responds to a steady hand, "I heard what Harlan Polk said to you at the feed store." Gerald did not look surprised that she had heard. "He cut the bread. He believes I have no stake here." Gerald said. And do you? Mabel said. She had not planned to ask it that way. It came out clean and unavoidable, the way true questions do, when you have stopped being afraid of the answer. Gerald set the bread knife down on the board. He looked at her across the table. He did not look away, and he did not fill the silence with something smaller than what it required. I did not when I came. I have been uncertain about it until recently. He picked up his cup and set it down without drinking. Mabel looked at her cup. And now, Mabel kept her eyes on her cup. He said, "Now I am less uncertain." That was all he said, and it was sufficient. She understood him, and she believed he understood that she understood him. And neither of them said anything more about it, and they finished the dinner, and he helped her carry the dishes to the basin. The matter of Harlan Polk did not resolve quietly. On the following Tuesday, Polk went to the property recorder and produced a document he claimed gave him first right of refusal on the Crandall lot, based on an agreement he said he had made with Tobias Crandall in the year 1871. The recorder, a careful man named Edmund Greer, told Polk that he would need to verify the document before recording anything, and that it would take a few days. Polk did not like this. He said so at some volume in the recorder office and in the street outside, and in the hotel dining room where he had his lunch. Mabel heard about this from Edmund Greer himself, who had been a patient of Robert years ago and still thought of her as something of an authority on matters requiring good judgment. Edmund told her the document looked irregular to him. The signature on the Crandall line was thin and tilted in a way that old Tobias had never written, and the paper itself was newer than it ought to have been, which he could not prove in a court, but which he could see. Mabel went home and found the box where she kept the box of papers that had belonged to Robert and her own. She had been a neighbor to Tobias Crandall for 11 years before he died. She knew his handwriting from the notes he passed over the fence, always requesting small things in his neat and very upright hand. She had kept several of them for no reason she could name, tucked in with the deed to the house and a survey Robert had commissioned in the first year of their marriage. She took 3 of the notes to Edmund Greer the next morning. She did not make a speech about it. She set them on his desk and stood back and let him look. Edmund looked for a long time. Then he looked at the document Polk had filed. Then he said, "This is not the same hand." "No," Mabel said, "it is not." That was all that needed saying. Edmund Greer began a quiet inquiry. It took 11 days. At the end of 11 days, Harlan Polk withdrew his claim on the property without explanation and without being forced to offer one publicly, because Edmund Greer was a careful man and preferred resolution to spectacle. Polk knew what Edmund knew, and he was not willing to have it made larger than it was. The result was that Gerald Marsh kept his house, and Harlan Polk kept his mercantile, and his lots, and his reputation, which was diminished in the eyes of anyone who had followed the 11 days quietly, which in a town the size of Dunmore was most of the adult population. Gerald came for Sunday dinner, and she told him what she had done only when he asked how it had come to be resolved the way it had. She said it plainly and without drama, because it did not seem to require drama. She had kept some notes. She had shown them to the man who needed to see them. That was the whole of it. Gerald listened. He was quiet for a moment when she finished. "You did not tell me you were doing it." Gerald looked at the table between them. It was not a rebuke. It was an observation with a question inside it. Mabel considered. "I thought you might tell me not to, and I was not willing to not do it." He looked at her in the particular way he had, steadily and without hurry, as though he was deciding something he had been considering for some time. He picked up the breadboard and turned it over in his hands. He ran his thumb along the edge where the walnut was joined, the place where Robert had fitted the piece with such care that no seam showed at all. "Your husband built this to last." Gerald set the board back down and looked at it for a moment longer. "He did," Mabel said. Gerald set the board down carefully in the center of the table. "I would like to call on you, if you are willing." He said it plainly, without decoration, with the full weight of what he meant behind the words. Mabel looked at the board. She looked at her cup. She thought about a single plate and a single cup, and the sound of her own name from only the minister and the postmaster, and a letter from Ohio. She thought about a hand extended in the cold November air. "I am willing." She did not look away when she said it. He nodded once. She could see the steadiness in him, and something beneath it that was not quite relief, but was close enough to it that she recognized it, because she felt it too. The evening after Gerald left, she sat at the table for a while without lighting the second lamp. The room was warm from the stove and quiet, and outside the last of the winter light was going gray over the mountains. She was not thinking about anything in particular. She was simply sitting in a kitchen that felt different than it had that morning, and she was letting herself notice that without explaining it away. She thought about what he had said, and the way he had said it. Not the words themselves so much as the manner of them, plain and unhurried, the same manner he brought to splitting wood or passing the bread. He did not use words as decoration. When he spoke, it meant something, and she had come over the months to trust that, the way you come to trust a tool that never slips. After a time, she rose and cleared the dishes and washed them and set them on the rack. She moved the breadboard back to the center of the table where Gerald had set it, which was not where she usually kept it. She looked at it there for a moment and decided to leave it. She put the kettle on and stood at the window while the water came up. The street was dark, and the snow on the ground threw back what little light came from the windows along the block. She could see the lamp in the downstairs window next door. She had seen that lamp on 10,000 evenings and had not thought much of it. Now it seemed different. Now it was a lamp in a window where a person she knew was going about the end of his day, and the knowing of it was a different thing than simply seeing the light. She had been afraid of this. She understood now. Not of Gerald Marsh in particular, but of what it meant to let something matter again. You get careful after enough loss. You stop putting things in windows where they can be seen. You stop setting tables for two. You tell yourself it is practicality and not fear, and sometimes you almost believe it. The kettle began to whistle, and she took it off the heat and poured 2 cups without thinking. She stood looking at the 2 cups on the counter. Then she laughed, very quietly, the way you laugh when something catches you being more hopeful than you meant to be. She poured 1 cup back into the kettle, but she left the second cup where it was. The spring came early to Dunmore that year, or perhaps it only seemed that way. By March, the town had quietly recalibrated itself around the new arrangement, the way small towns do when something settles that had been unsettled. It was not dramatic. There was no announcement. People simply began to see what was there to be seen, which was that the widow Forsyth and the quiet man from the feed store ate Sunday dinner together and walked to the Sunday social together, and that he handled her things with the same care he brought to everything, and she spoke to him with the same directness she had always had, and they seemed to suit each other in the way of 2 people who have been worn smooth by time and loss and have stopped pretending that does not make certain things easier. Mrs. Halverson from down the block said to her one morning in April, when Mabel was bringing in the wash from the line, that she was glad to see it. She said it in the simple and sincere way older women in that time allowed themselves to say such things, without sentimentality and without hedging. Mabel thanked her and meant it. She did not tell Mrs. Halverson that she had been afraid. She did not think it would add anything. The fear had been of the usual and understandable kind, the fear that runs underneath long solitude, the fear that you have become someone to whom belonging no longer applies, that after enough years of a single plate you stop being the kind of person who sets a second one, that the habit of being alone becomes the shape of you, permanent as a scar, and no amount of wanting changes it. She had set the second plate anyway. She had set it that Sunday morning in November, standing in the kitchen with the snow coming down and the lamp burning in the window next door. She had set it on the table and stood back and looked at it and was frightened and went out into the cold and knocked on the door anyway. That was the moment. Not dinner. Not the Harlan Polk trouble. Not the evening Gerald said he was less uncertain. The moment was the knock on the door in the snow. Everything after that was only the consequence of not walking away. In April, Gerald asked her to walk out with him on a Sunday evening after dinner, which she did, and they walked the length of Larimer Street to the edge of the town where the road turned north toward the mountains. And they stood looking at the peaks still white above the dark pines, and she realized she had not looked at those mountains, truly looked at them the way you look at something beautiful without the accompanying sadness, since Robert died. She said so. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had not looked at much without some sadness attached to it for a long time either, and that he noticed lately it had been different, and he thought he knew why. She did not ask him to say more. She understood him. They stood there a while longer. The light over the peaks went from gold to a pale rose, and then to nothing, and neither of them moved to leave until the cold made it necessary. Then they walked back to Larimer Street as the last color went out of the sky, and the air settled into the particular stillness of a spring evening in the high country. At the gate she thanked him for the walk. He said he would come Thursday to split the wood she had been putting off, because the pile she had stacked in November was running low. She said there was no need. He said he would come Thursday. She said, then come for supper after. He said he would. It was the whole of what they needed to say. She had been alone for a long time. She had made a life of it, a decent and quiet and sufficient life, and she did not think less of it for being that. But this was more. Not because grief ended. She did not believe it ended. She believed it changed, the way a river changes when another stream joins it. It does not become a different river. It becomes larger, deeper in some places, quieter in others, carrying more than it carried before. She was 53 years old, and it was spring in Dunmore, Colorado, and there was wood to split on Thursday and supper after, and a man who handled things with care and spoke plainly, and had stood with her without being asked to. She had spent a long season waiting for solitude to feel like enough. She had found, without quite meaning to, that she had stopped waiting.